Hi everyone, welcome to Vancouver Real Estate Today. I'm Realtor Josh Kepke, and today I'm here with my good friend Siavash Tahan, and he has recently written an article for Palladium magazine called "What No One Wants to Admit About Housing Politics," and the message is that land is a scam. So here's the thing, homeowners, homebuyers, investors, we all want to find that perfect property to move into and to eventually sell for a profit. And we want to make that purchase in a place with affordable, safe, quality homes, communities, and businesses. Why? So we can actually enjoy our lives, take vacations, and spend the quality time we want with the people we love. How do we do all this without risking a fortune and running ourselves ragged? That's the big question, and this show is dedicated to the answer. So Siavash is actually a real estate and urban development market analyst right here in Vancouver, and he's very follows politics and so Siavash, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into the article.
Sure. My name is Siavash. I work in real estate development in Vancouver. Most of my projects revolve around feasibility studies for land development. So whether that's city governments, they need to rezone land for additional housing or commercial space. Sometimes it's large sort of landowners, farms, First Nations, farmers, First Nations, sometimes industrial landowners that want to convert their land and change the uses on it and whether there's a market for it. So I write basically market feasibility studies for that. So that's my job. My article, however, I wrote after my experiences in the industry, seeing how a lot of the pace of urban development is frustrated by a sort of hostility by neighborhood groups against change, and how this causes escalating rents and worsens the affordability situation. So that's where my work and my experience in the industry has sort of informed my political opinion of what should be done in terms of city government policies or provincial policies that can accelerate the creation of more housing and over time bring the sort of the cost burden of housing down.
Right, it's super timely right now with a city council that's not really getting much done. I think we do see some of the kind of coalitions you're speaking of in the article of different political groups, small p political groups, and kind of embodied by maybe some of the councillors, and timely in the sense that we're not building anything really, at least downtown, and that we're looking at an environment where rents are going to go up significantly if we don't build and add some supply in the next 3 to 5 years, with all these big tech companies arriving, Amazon, Apple, you name it, arriving into new office towers. So they're not leaving old space for other companies. They're just new players in new expensive offices, bringing the new talent with them, who will jump into the rental market most likely. So I think this is a great time to have this conversation. So again, what no one wants to admit about housing politics. Why is land a scam? Maybe just give me the thesis of the article here.
Land is a scam is like a sort of a joke phrase that I came up with when I went on a cruise in 2016. On the cruise ship, the quality of sort of entertainment and hospitality and food and cleanliness is very high. And the cost is relatively low. At least the one I went on was only about $100 a night per person. Which is not little, but it's not a lot. I mean, if you're going to any regular hotel, checking in, if you're going to France or California or Toronto or anywhere that you travel to, you're going to be paying more than $100 a night just for your hotel, let alone your high quality food, your steak and lobsters, as I always say.
Yeah.
So on the cruise ship, when I only paid $100 a night, I thought to myself, why is the cruise so much more efficient than a regular life? If I had to have the same quality of life on the cruise ship that I want, if I had on the land the same quality of life that I have on the cruise ship, it would cost me much more than $100 a night. It would cost me $500 a night to have my apartment cleaned 2 times a day, to have my steak and lobsters, unlimited amounts, a dance show every night, an art show, singing groups. So I thought, why is the cost structure so much more affordable on a cruise ship? And the reason is because the workers are paid little, And the reason that workers can get away with being paid little is that, one, they don't have rent to pay. So you're an international worker on a cruise ship, you get maybe $500 to $1,000 US per month, but you have no cost. All your food is also free. You have no transportation costs. You take the elevator to your restaurant that you work at. And that $500 to $1,000 a month, that is fully saved. And especially if you're from a developing country like Philippines or Mexico or these countries that these people are from, $1,000 a month is a lot of money and all saved. Now they work really hard. They work long hours. But the point I'm trying to make is that if that worker was to work in a restaurant in Vancouver or in Toronto or in LA, that worker, you can't get away with paying him $500. And it's not because he's greedy or anything. It's because he can't live on that. That's not a livable wage. You have to pay him $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 to do the same kind of work. But that is basically just, you're paying him his rent and his taxes, because your taxes are high on the land and your rent is high on the land. And if you guys look at your own budgets, you'll see that taxes and rent or mortgage, if you're a homeowner, consume about 50 to 60% of your annual or monthly income. So by offshoring yourself on a cruise ship and working on a cruise ship, you're saving 50 to 60% costs and you save all of your income. So the point is that we need to do things that lower the rent on the land. And part of the effort for this is to increase the supply of housing, to allow rents to fall, or at least to allow the increase that they're experiencing to decelerate. And that would make the quality of life better, because rent is sort of like an excess payment that you're paying. You're not getting any better work for it, for living on the land. The worker is doing the same work if he lives and works in a restaurant on the land as he would if he was working and living on a cruise ship.
Right. So we'll get into some other ideas of how we might get rents to come down. I agree with you, though. That's the only way to save any money right now, is to somehow get your rent costs down or make it non-existent, which is, we kind of offload that responsibility. A lot of people just stay at home, move in with their parents.
Or they couple up so they can save on
couple
rent.
up. That's an unfortunate thing. Yeah, people just kind of end up in relationships for
that are not
couple
necessarily
housing.
the best. Yeah.
And but that's not an option available to everyone, because a lot of people are new to Vancouver, coming from other places, so they don't have parents here. They're like myself, their parents have left town already, so you do have to pay that rent. So all that aside,
The rent is too damn high.
yes, all that aside, and getting into that later, let me ask you, what does Vancouver look like in your mind if we built it all out, right? If tomorrow you woke up and we had all the supply we needed, what are the single family neighborhoods where all these houses that we love to look at are? What do they look like? What do the arterials look like? Do you have a vision for that?
Well, my vision is to just allow people to do what they want to do with their property. So if you allowed, within certain reasonable boundaries.
No meth labs.
No, no meth labs, no grow ups, none of that stuff. But if you want to put a duplex, if you want to turn your house that's on, let's say, an 8,000 square foot lot, and you have a house that's 2,000 square foot, if you want to put a laneway house or a coach house or turn it into a duplex, or even make suites, legalized suites, you should be able to do that without headaches.
Right.
So what a free, liberalized policy on housing in the city of Vancouver would look like basically 4 floors and corner stores everywhere, except the highly transit accessible areas. There is so much demand for housing in Vancouver. I always joke with my friends that if you allow Vancouver to build the housing that the market demands and what the people in Canada want, the entire country of Canada will empty out into Vancouver, because no one wants to really live in Saskatoon if you can live in Vancouver for roughly comparable rents. So you would have a sort of a European vibe across the city of Vancouver, especially in the more green sort of neighborhoods.
Sure.
You wouldn't really have large single family houses, except in an eclectic manner, i.e. people didn't want to sell to a land development, land assembly. But there's a clue as to what the free market demand for housing is that if you look at neighborhoods like Marpole, which allowed higher density in the 1970s, and you go look there, you have basically 5-6 story rental apartments there. So what you can conclude from that is that in the 1970s, there was demand for 5-6 stories in Marpole, which is not a very good area of Vancouver. It's under a bridge, near bridges. It's kind of a little bit seedy and kind of industrial, or at least it used to be. So that is what the free market demand is. So when people are mad about 8 stories in Kitsilano or whatever, because that's too much, that's absurd. The free market demand for Kitsilano would be 30, 40, 50-story towers. And there would be people like you, realtors, who could sell one bedrooms at $500,000, $600,000 in Kitsilano all day long, because there's basically infinite demand for such things. So yeah, that is what a free and open sort of market would look like for land development and housing.
Right.
And that would control rents as well, because the greater amount of supply you have, the more choice that tenants and renters have. Because if you're a landlord and I'm a landlord and someone else is looking to rent an apartment from us, I charge $2,200, but you can come in and undercut me at $2,100, and that benefit goes to the tenant, which in the end is good, because it lowers his cost structure, it allows him to save more, and it allows businesses to operate better because the rents are lower, so they can save on their own commercial operating costs as well as on salaries and wages.
So I'm picturing a lot of 4 floors and corner stores, maybe more triplexes, fourplexes, some gentle density,
Townhomes.
a lot of townhomes and more towers, probably 8 floors. I'm wondering if that happened all across the city. Now I forget the percentage of neighborhoods that are single family, 70%?
I don't know the percentage of neighborhoods are predominantly single family, but I know the amount of land that is zoned for single family residential is about 70% of land.
70%, there you go. So that's all now gone.
Because
almost
we're
all gone, going into our highest and best use here.
Exactly.
And does that start to turn people away from Vancouver on the international scene? Do we become less desirable? Because in my experience with some clients who originate from places like Holland, France, they come here to get away from the European vibe, right? They come. The dream is to have that house up in the woods in North Vancouver. This is kind of that last place on earth where you can get that. And while where we are right now, the form is staying the same, but the people are changing.
Yes.
Right, and it gets ever more expensive. So do the people stop changing if the form changes to that extent?
That is a great, almost philosophical question, actually. You will allow new neighbors to come. On your point about the desire for sort of more rural settings, that's totally legitimate, and that should be allowed to exist, and it does exist in rural areas or in outer suburbs. So people are free to do that. You can go to the islands, Bowen Island, those kind of islands. You can go to Vancouver Island, you can go to North Shore, and those places, the highest and best use might not exactly be 4 floors or corner stores or high rises. It would still remain cottage, little town feel, little village feel. But in the desirable areas that are in the inner ring suburbs, so like Burnaby, New West, Richmond, Vancouver, maybe North Surrey and Coquitlam, those areas, the highest and best use would be much more than single family homes. But the single family homes will continue existing in South Surrey, Langley, Aldergrove, all those places will remain like that.
You know what we might see, actually, I think, is if we had no restrictions, Vancouver becomes New York, just a newer version. Because I'm 90% sure it doesn't matter, like, you can do whatever you want if you own the land in New York. And they build ever taller towers there. That's just the name of the game, who's got the biggest tower.
Well, actually, New York, you cannot do whatever you want.
You can?
No, these cities are extremely regulated on these things. They do have really tall towers, but that's a special exception. They generally don't allow it. There's actually less people living in Manhattan Island now than there was in the 1900s.
Wow.
Part of that is because of slum clearances. So a lot of slums that are full of poor tenants, they crammed in back in the 1900s. So clearing those areas allows the population to decline, which is not necessarily good, but higher quality housing needs to be provided.
Okay, so my bad. New York, you can't do what you want. They just have really tall towers. So maybe
a city like Tokyo and Austin have loosened zoning laws, which means you're more allowed to build housing than generally. You're never going to have city governments allowing you to do anything you want. But things like putting a duplex, things like modest things, it should be allowed.
The duplexes I've found difficult, at least for Vancouver, because it's not a profitable margin for a builder at this point. So the housing has to really decay to a certain point.
Yeah.
But I get what you're saying. I think what'll be really interesting to watch for in the next, I don't know what the timeline is, let's call it 20 years, 50 years, houses going up the mountainside and into the mountains. We're seeing it right now. If you drive up Cypress, it's happening. We've got a lot of wilderness out there to push into. So it's just a matter of getting the utilities out there, which is the job of the city. But let's shift back towards the article. I want to talk a lot about how the NIMBY movement, the not in my backyard, let's call them those people, are kind of making everything stop. And the result of that being these urban pathologies that you speak of in your article being sprawl out into further neighborhoods afield where you have longer commutes into the downtown, which ends up being the economic hub, increased homelessness, the tent cities we're seeing pop up more and more, not only in Vancouver, but Los Angeles, and really something that I think both of you and I can attest to is less leisure time. We got to work a lot. It's okay when we like what we do, but you had to really, my arm had to get twisted to go to, when we went to Los Angeles with a couple buddies there.
It's good that you came in last minute though.
Yeah, so.
Your arm almost did get really twisted though.
Yeah, that's another story. But let's talk about this coalition to try to overcome the NIMBYs. Maybe I'll let you take it away.
Sure. So of course, NIMBYs generally are middle-class people who are homeowners in these desirable cities, in these desirable neighborhoods of these desirable cities, and they are very scared of change. They're scared that new apartments or new rental towers or whatever bring in either poor people that are going to be more likely to do drugs or do crime and such. They can't say it directly, but so they have to hide behind the fact that they think that, they're worried about a laundromat that is being closed down, and this strip mall shouldn't change. They should remain as a strip
parking.
mall. Oh yeah, we need more parking. we on-street parking, but they're really worried about people who don't fit into the social fabric of the community. Sometimes they're also worried about tech bros coming in, so richer people or better paid people as well. So they want stasis, and that's a very legitimate thing. You want your hometown, you want your community, your home to be comfortable and secure and to give a sense of permanence to you. So that's a legitimate sentiment that they have. I'm not saying it's illegitimate, but I'm saying that sentiment, it has been allowed to hijack our urban development plans, and it causes these pathologies. So if you have restrictionism on how much you can build, you have higher rents, you have less production of new housing, and then you have the sprawl. I don't want to see the houses go up on the mountain. I don't want the trees to come down. There's a Burke Mountain in Coquitlam you're probably familiar with. Yeah. Big houses built there, newer, but it's sad because it's beautiful wilderness there. Well, wilderness in an urban setting. And you don't want to see that, so you should restrict that sort of development in the greenfield sites, and allow more development in areas that we know people want to be. We know people want to be in North Burnaby. We know people want to be in East Van. We know people want to be in Kitsilano. We know people want to be in downtown. So let's allow them to actualize their preference.
Would you say that the NIMBYs are, because they're generally people who've lived here for a long time, they have tenure, as Gordon Price kind of called it, and they kind of have this attitude of wanting to unionize land ownership or citizenship.
That's a good point, yeah.
I've got seniority over you because I grew up here. Yes, that's a very good point, yeah. So it's a bit of an entitlement.
It is. It is exactly that. I remember my town looking like this, and it should look like this.
I feel that way about Deep Cove, to be totally transparent.
I was at Deep Cove a couple weeks ago, actually.
Yeah. Luckily, nobody really wants to build east of the Seymour as much, so it's safe for a little while longer, and they're very much NIMBYs there.
Yes.
But it means it's going to be very difficult for me to ever get back there, which I recognize.
So as the form didn't change, but the people have been evicted, basically. You can't get back there. You can't afford back there. Like, I grew up in North Burnaby. I can't afford apartments there, houses there. But my parents could.
Yeah, exactly.
20 years ago, so 15 years ago.
Yeah, it's romanticized, You get there, it won't be as good as you remember. That's what I think.
You're remembering the childhood, not the...
Exactly. And you got to have a wife and kid before you can go back to Deep Cove. So how can we integrate people back into these communities without jeopardizing the social fabric that is so not commoditized, but valuable and has real value. And yeah, it's that community. That's why I like Deep Cove. It's a community.
Mm-hmm. Well, communities are created by sort of spontaneous order, by people meeting each other and vibing with each other well. Greater density will allow more of that. It also will allow more of the opposite of community feel, infractions, negative interactions. One of the ways you could try to create better communities with additional housing and additional residents is to have more formalized system of accepting new people. So if you do have bigger apartments being built, you have sort of bylaw restrictions that allow you to select people who are more community oriented. If you're an older person, for example, you don't want children and you don't want young professionals really, you want a more seniors friendly community. So you can put in things like people who live here must be 55 plus. If it's the opposite case, you want more families there, you can put must have children. Now these are not existing now, and it's hard to tell whether they can be instituted, but I want to open the door on that discussion in the future. You should be able to sort of restrict or select for characteristics that you want. And that is really what people are worried about when there is additional housing. They're scared that the new people that come there are going to be an invasive species almost. So you can protect against the invasion of tech bros or renters or whatever that people are worried about moving into their neighborhoods through formalized ways rather than through the informal, no development.
Okay. Is it tech bros or tech pros?
Bros.
Tech bros. Okay.
It's a phenomenon in San Francisco.
Yeah,
and,
I get it in the context of San Francisco.
Yeah. It's going to be happening in Vancouver, as you said. There's 5 million square feet of office space. Amazon taking, I think, 400,000 square feet or 300,000. So 5 million square feet, that's 20,000 jobs, and a lot
70% by new arrival companies.
Yeah.
So we would say, well, let's get into the covenant aspect of that you mentioned in the article and in another interview you did. But what we've done thus far to try to protect this social fabric or to keep those invaders out, as you say, is I liked how you framed up the city planning policies, and that really these modern zoning policies are a legacy of racial segregation. And that's the things like minimum lot sizes, and things of that nature to keep this certain shape and form, and then it just becomes an economic barrier to keep people out by another means. But we were talking. What were you thinking about covenants? Because we were talking about keeping. If it's a case of an older community and we don't want to have children, we don't want to have renters, that's something that can be in bylaws on a strata. I guess if it's single-family homes, you can do a bare land strata, but
it's much more popular in America. There's effectively private suburbs in large parts of America.
Gated communities. Yeah, I have a hard time with bare land strata because you got to pay a maintenance fee, and that's
you're like, wait, why do I have a house there?
It's a lot of fees. Tell me a bit more about what you got into in the second half of the article in terms of that.
Yeah, so originally there was a lot of racial covenants. So people in BC and in Anglo countries had sort of the elite. They wanted a racially homogenous neighborhood or community, and they did that by putting exclusions like no Chinese allowed, no Indian allowed, or whatever. Those were eventually struck down by courts largely as against civil rights in the U.S. and Canada, and then the same impetus towards keeping a certain class of people in a neighborhood couldn't be actualized through formal ways of no black people or Chinese people, whatever, allowed, but it got converted, that impetus, into minimum lot size, maximum density, and that way you can make poor people unable to afford living here, which disproportionately sort of restricts the entrance of racial minorities to better neighborhoods, I guess. So the impetus behind the modern exclusionary zoning or restrictionist zoning is specifically for the purposes of keeping things expensive and scarce, which would keep poor people out and away. So I want to reverse that. I want to make things cheaper and more available for poor people, for rich people, for workers, for families, whatever. And the way you do that is to not have these restrictions about density, or to weaken the restrictions about density, minimum lot sizes, and that kind of stuff.
Fantastic. I totally agree that we got ways to go with those policies. Like West Point Grey is a huge minimum lot size.
Yeah,
but
we got 18,000 square foot lot in like beachfront areas. No one's getting in unless you're literally an heir to a fortune or something.
Exactly. So you'd asked me about co-ops before we started recording. As how does that work for maybe a way to get around, to have some other kinds of ways of protecting the social fabric and excluding some people, but maybe not along the lines of race, obviously. Co-ops are a pain in the ass. I gotta be honest with you. I sold somebody into one this year, and you have to have 35% down. I'm sure we could come up with a financial structure where that didn't have to be the case if we had a new co-ops. But what they are what we had before. We had the strata titled properties. It predates that. So people own the building as a company, and people own shares in that company. So you buy shares. And what's common with them is they have a lot more restrictions. Generally, no rentals. Age restrictions are common, that they had age restrictions on the one that this couple purchased. So nobody could actually have kids and stay there. It's 19 plus. So if you have a kid, you got to sell and move, because you can't rent it out either. So there is a bit of that, and you're also subject to a board approval. So the board approval process, what could I say about it? It's not terrible by any means.
But it's opaque.
Yeah, they don't have to have any transparency or tell you why they are turning it down. So maybe if you could bring some transparency to a board approval process, that might be good.
But the point that follows from what you're saying is that yes, they have a lot of restrictions and such, but tell me, are they more affordable?
It's 10% cheaper generally to get a co-op.
I thought it was more than 10%, because the one that you listed, it looked like a steal. If it was a strata, it'd be like 40% more affordable.
It was a steal.
It was a steal.
Yeah, it was an older building.
It was like 350 grand or something, wasn't it?
How did that sell
For, like,
for?
Kitsilano?
It was underpriced to generate multiple bids. And we sold it for $395.
That's still a steal.
Yeah.
Was it large too?
It wasn't large. It was 550 square feet or so. It was
Standard.
a good place for a student to go into.
Yeah.
And what I told the parents ultimately was, if you're gonna be renting a place for your son for the next 4 years while he goes to UBC, do you realize that you're probably throwing away $100,000 if you're putting him in an equivalent place?
Yeah.
Whereas with this, you're paying yourself. You could sell it after. You might realize some equity
Uplift,
gains, and if somehow you held it forever, it would likely have a strata or a wind down.
Co-op wind down, yeah.
And which is when they buy out the building and then put something taller up for those who aren't familiar. So yeah, they are cheaper. That 35% barrier is significant.
That becomes the difficulty, yeah.
It is, but I do think this model of public housing is something that everyone's getting excited about, or at least talking about more. And the election just happened for Canada, and I interviewed a few politicians. Don't ask me why I did that. It was an interesting experience, but nobody could tell me why they were supporting public housing, because I would tell them, well, like, do I have to still put 35% down? Because then it's kind of a wash, because not a lot of people have that down payment. So
sorry, public housing or social housing,
they
or
were talking
co-op?
about doing more co-ops and this and that, and I said, well, if someone's got to put down 35%, that's not really going to make it feasible, and nobody could really explain it, so they were just delivering the soundbite for the party, unfortunately. I'll say Talib Noor Mohammed had a good, he was informed on the subject, but what I liked was when I was talking to architect James Bly in a previous episode, and he was saying, what we've got to do is get away from land as a commodity to be made rich on. And I think we're starting to shift that way. It's an issue that I see of baby boomers telling their kids, buy land, buy property, because look what it did for me.
Yeah.
I got all this money over all this time.
This is an ancient proverb. Land brings you up.
Yeah, so we need to get rid of that paradigm somehow, which is very difficult because it has yielded a lot. But I don't know that
It's
we're
hard to
going
argue with people's back pockets.
I just don't know if we're going to be able to realize that same gains like crazy unless it's upon rezoning or a strata wind down. But like the governments are they're savvy to it now. They're going to tax that money back. They're going to take it back, right? There's the talk of this land.
Yeah, the CAC. That's legitimate in my opinion for the city governments to tax value gain from rezoning back, because that value gain is not due to the effort of the landowner or the developer. What is not legitimate is taxes on development. Those should not be allowed because you're taxing something that is good. You want development. You want more housing. Again, my whole goal is to have more. To allow people to save more and to allow cost of living to decline.
Yeah.
And the best way to do that is through rent declines, because rent is such a large part of people's housing budgets. And the way you bring down the rent is you allow more housing. So whatever social housing, whatever agenda you might have is fine, as long as it results in more housing, which will eventually result in lower rents or lower rents compared to income.
But funny enough, the people that are sort of part of this coalition that's not letting the housing get built, this high-low coalition or...
The high and low is
what's a FIMBY? Tell us what a FIMBY is.
FIMBY are people who say that they support public housing only as a condition of redevelopment. They don't support market housing, so they don't support private rentals or private condos. They only support state public housing for lower income or for families or whatever. Yeah. Again, that is fine. That's totally okay. But at the end of the day, you need to rezone and you need to build that housing. So if you're really genuine FIMBY, you should be excited about the prospect of a developer building something and then for themselves, for private use, and then also sort of gifting social housing to the city or to a nonprofit housing providing company. But sometimes these FIMBYs are not genuine in their concern about affordability. So, for example, there was a case in Kiefer, on Kiefer Street in downtown, in Chinatown, there was a developer that had the right to build 4 stories, I believe, of market, but it was asking the city and the community for permission to build 8 stories, and was in exchange giving 1 story as social housing to seniors, so elderly residents in the community, primarily of Chinese descent. And the FIMBYs and the NIMBYs, they dropped their guard, they dropped their pretenses, they said no to that. They were against rezoning and redeveloping an empty parking lot into an 8-story, 7 of which are condo, 1 of which is social housing. So you know that they're lying about their interests in affordability. They don't care about social housing for seniors. They just didn't want anything built. They preferred to keep people out of that area.
Yeah, they're more bananas.
Yes.
What does banana stand for again?
Build absolutely nothing near anything, something like that.
Yeah. Well, that was an interesting one to watch unfurl, and it was really heated. I remember being at a talk at Inform Interiors, and one of the people on the side of Don't Build came into the back of this talk and started yelling at the architect speaking. I think he's also a developer, is Gare Williamson, I think is his name, and just calling him the devil and you're evil. And you know what? Big props to the Inform Interiors crew and Nancy, who runs that place. They didn't kick her out. They handled it with grace. But yeah, it was ugly. But
and it's unfortunate that it has to be like this. It doesn't need to be like this.
Yeah.
People should be excited to have neighbors.
What about the ones who are, at least I would say, are authentic in their concerns for affordability, but maybe too narrow-minded? I'm thinking of one city councilor in particular who says no to rental developments because the rents aren't $800 and it's not going to happen.
So it's pretty clear that she's disingenuous then, at that point. If you you say no to rental housing for, what was it, townhouses in Shaughnessy? I think
Yeah,
she
it
voted
was-
against. And the rents for those townhouses were $2,400 or $3,000 a
But
month.
they weren't 800.
But they're not 800. But this person is delusional. She's living in a fantasy world.
Yeah.
Or she's disingenuous. I don't know which is worse, but clearly you don't care about actually bringing the rent down, because if you don't build those townhouses, they're going to remain as mansions, which is not going to be $2,400 family housing. It's going to be $6,000 a month mansion rental, or whatever that market segment is like. So yeah, you can tell who's a real FIMBY, who's genuine, if they vote yes on rental housing in expensive areas, because the rental housing in those areas is going to be cheaper than the single family housing there. So if you vote yes on rental housing, you're actually pushing the needle towards more affordability. But she votes no on rental housing.
It's that everyone gets caught up on the word affordable, right?
And it's unfortunate because the CMHC, the provincial and the federal governments, they don't actually have a definition of it. There's an informal definition of the 30% of gross income.
And that comes out of this Vienna model of housing that I want to speak about in a moment. But I'll say what I do love about Jean Swanson, who we're talking about, is the battle cry of like, it's too expensive for so many of us, and
Which is true.
But when you're the politician, you got to get stuff done, and it's different from being an activist, which is something I think been the main critique of her.
I believe Jean Swanson is actually a landowner, and I think she's the wealthiest person on council.
No, that's Colleen Hardwick probably.
Oh, you're right. Sorry, Colleen Hardwick.
Jean, I think, lives in public housing somewhere in a co-op, one of those older co-ops.
I don't think so.
I've
seen the disclosure.
Somebody fact check us on that. I don't know. But I appreciate the sentiment, but I think there's elements of practicality that you gotta step to. And even if it is really expensive at the moment on the rental front,
it's not $2,400 for a townhouse or $3,000 for a townhouse.
That's a good
family
that one was
normal
good.
people can afford that. Nurses, teachers.
But there's always this argument of if it's expensive, it'll come down because it's brand new right now, and maybe that's something to be looked at closer.
That's for sure. So the neighborhood in the West End, when it was originally built, it was an expensive neighborhood, and it was high rises, and a lot of people were opposed to that as well. But as it gets older, it has become the most vibrant neighborhood, in my opinion, and it's actually consistently ranked as the best neighborhood, even though it was originally hated by the people.
It's true.
And it was originally expensive. But as it gets older and more established, it becomes the lovely neighborhood. And that is what will happen in everywhere else. Yaletown, it was originally like that. We both live in Yaletown. And every neighborhood, there's a big battle about whether more density should be allowed, and a lot of passion about people wanting to not develop. 20 years later, everyone likes it. It's where the affordable is. It's where the cool kids are hanging out. It's where everyone aspires to live in. So allow more of that, and in 20, 30 years, it will be much better and easier on your wallets then
Just build us something.
Yes.
Right, so I want to talk about the Vienna model of housing that James Bly had brought up with me on a previous show. Their model is 60% of the housing stock there is social housing, and people pay no more than 30% of their income. So I think that's something that there's the appetite for, the desire for here. But is that realistic? Like, how are we? That just mean every project we do going forward's got to be social housing? What do you think of this model and the feasibility of us having something like that?
I have no opposition to social housing. You can build social housing of a good quality, but the cost to build is quite expensive. And it's a lot money-losing proposition for the city governments to embark on it themselves. They are better off sort of off-sourcing or that work to developers in exchange for higher density. I really don't like the idea of social housing being in the same tower or in the same development of market housing. They should be separated because there's a sort of cultural clash between these things. But it's totally legitimate to have more social housing. But before you have social housing, you have to rezone, and you actually have to build it.
Right.
So again, you can tell who's disingenuous or who's genuine about the desire for social housing by whether they're okay with huge swaths of single-family homes being rezoned for social housing, rental housing, family housing, that kind of stuff.
So if we need the developers, which we've determined we do, great segue into what's happening with the Squamish Nation's plan to construct 11 towers and 6,000 units at the foot of the south foot of the Burrard Bridge. And then there's also, well, let's not talk about Metrotown, but that's another big thing that's happening. Now we've got is this the people we're sort of we're offloading this job to, because they own the land now, they get benefit by holding on to the land.
The First Nations you're talking about, the Squamish Nation.
The Squamish Nation, or the MST Corporation.
I'm very excited about the prospects of First Nations becoming big players in development in BC. As you know, a lot of BC was not ceded to First Nations, and the legal status of this land is always up to court challenges, especially when the public sector wants to sell parcels of land. The First Nations, I believe, almost always have the first right of refusal. So it is exciting that they're pursuing these things. And one of the ways that they can do this is big developers have allied with First Nations against sort of the NIMBY middle class, the NIMBY incumbent homeowners, what do you call the unionized, or Gordon Price called the unionized residents.
The neighborhood associations.
Yeah, against neighborhood. It's a big problem in San Francisco, the neighborhood associations.
Yeah,
They're
here
the
too.
biggest NIMBYs. Anyway, so you have the high developers allying with sort of people who are migrating into cities, allying with activists and such, to allow First Nations sort of sovereignty over parcels of land that they own. And that is doing an end run against the NIMBYs and the residents who are generally opposed to new development. So you basically cut them out, which is good in some ways, because one, it's a nice form of reconciliation in terms of now the First Nation gets to actually majorly benefit from their land. And two, because you produce 3,000, 5,000, 6,000 new units of housing in a relatively desirable area. So it's good. I'm excited for the prospects of more things like this and the future development of MST Corporation.
See, I'm smiling because I just was thinking of what I read. One of the guys who runs the neighborhood association down in Kitts, and he's an architect too. He had said, well, I hope they would at least consult with us. And it's just kind of ironic because, well, it's our land to begin with, so you didn't consult with us when you stole it from us. But, but you know what? Playing devil's advocate, when I walk my dog around West Point Grey, it's really nice. And if I lived up there and I owned a house out there, I might not be able to take the perspective I have now, and I might want to fight tooth and nail to keep it the same, because it's gorgeous.
But it's gorgeous largely because of the geographic scenery that is around there. Why not allow more housing there so that you have more people enjoying the gorgeousness?
Change is scary. That's why.
You take your dog on walks in Yaletown and West End too, and those areas are nice too.
It's just more convenient. Don't have to drive. That's the thing. I don't want to drive anywhere. But if we want to look at who the bad actors are in that kind of landowner class, or the class that have a lot of horsepower in terms of assets, wealth, I wanted to bring up this film I just saw at the Architect and Design Film Festival called Push. So this is a film that it follows around Ottawa-based Leilani Farha, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing. So she's investigating in this film, how private equity firms are profiting from the global housing crisis. One part that stuck out for me was this private equity firm called Blackstone. And they had
about 10,000 houses in Phoenix.
They own 50,000 single-family houses that they rent out, and they got all of these places during the financial crisis. And then they rent them back out. But so what she's done here is on this mission to prompt an international paradigm shift, and she's exposing how these financial players are turning affordable housing markets into tradable commodities. And how do we get away from that? I think when we're talking about putting things on restrictive covenants on titles to properties, bylaw restrictions. How do we get this class of not even the individuals, because I understand it on a one-on-one basis, people who want to build wealth for their family and buy an investment condo and rent that out, and now they've made some rental housing. But these big institutions or actors like Airbnb that come in and financialize our homes and take the money elsewhere, right? It's like the Starbucks on the
Well,
corner.
Airbnb
right?
does not take the money elsewhere. You're thinking of Marriott Hotel that actually takes the money elsewhere.
That's true.
I actually
Airbnb
support.
pockets a little bit.
That's okay, because these are the actual local people who have it. I don't see any problem with investor groups buying housing and building housing. That's not, so what? That's a good thing. Or if the state wants to do it, or nonprofits want to do it, or co-op associations, that's fine.
But what about buying up these affordable housing areas?
Well, they bought houses in Phoenix,
Yeah.
which is cheap forever. It's always going to be cheap.
Right.
Because there's so much land there, and it's relatively loose land use policies there as well. That's not a problem in my opinion.
Okay, what stuck with me on this, and if you watched the film, because I know you haven't seen it because it's new and it was just the other day I saw it, was the one guy they're following around is a pensioner, and they show how the money that goes into these private equity firms is pension funds.
That's definitely true.
So the guy who's getting kicked out of his place it's his pension fund that's kicking him out.
That's
and you're kind of like, wow, that's very strange to see.
Yeah, it's kind of Kafkaesque. Most of the big financial corporations and the big investor pools, Blackstone, these private equity companies, their biggest clients, their biggest investors are pension funds. And the pension funds of teachers, nurses, police officers, soldiers, government workers. So yeah, the actual big capitalists in the world, they're just the workers. They're the servants of the pension funds, which are the money of retirees. Yeah. So in a way, it's all circular. So I don't have any sort of...
there's no fingers to point at.
There's no fingers. Yeah,
can't.
Exactly. What are you going to say? You're going to get mad at your grandma for wanting a $2,000 a month pension or whatever,
right?
Instead of a $1,500 a month pension.
Yeah, I don't know what the answers are. You know what I do think is our shift to being more transparent on who owns land in DC.
That's totally good.
Is a really good thing. Say what you will about the NDP government, that's a good move.
Well, even in my opinion, the foreign buyers tax was fine. Well, that was brought in by the BC Liberals, but again, these are just good things that are side to the issue. The real issue is the rent is too high.
Yeah,
we need more housing. I don't want to see cases where there's 20 people, 25 people for one bedroom apartment in Marpole or in Mount Pleasant. This is not good. We want people to spend 20 to 30% of their income on housing so that they can enjoy the rest of the amenities that urban life offers rather than slaving to pay the rent.
So before we wrap it up here, is there anything you wanna add that I didn't ask you? Do you wanna leave any thoughts or maybe your vision or hopes or whatever on the future of the city and housing and so on? I encourage people to get involved, to look up a group called Abundant Housing Vancouver. I think you might be going to the holiday party.
You're going to the holiday party? Nice. It's generally a good group. They are young people, young professionals, some of them young families, a lot of them from Vancouver, but also a lot from Toronto or back east. And they are sort of activists along the lines of more housing. For too long, the public discourse around development and urban housing has been dominated by NIMBYs who don't want anything, who are always complainers. It's nice to see a group of young sort of people, fresh-faced, attractive. They make their voice heard about wanting housing and wanting neighbors and wanting a more livable urban core. And in the end result is that you have less commutes, you have less travel time, and you have less pollution, and you have less sprawl, which is what you want if you want to transition to a more affordable and a more green future.
So I know you're working a lot. I know you just want to watch Netflix and chill out, but just show up. Because if you don't show up and you don't want to make your voice heard, you're just going to have to live with the decisions someone else is making for you. I think that's the message here.
If you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
That's a good one. I like that. Much more succinct. And how can people find out more about you? Or you have like a Twitter or a website or
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm an author at a magazine called Palladium, which is the basis of our conversation in the article I wrote. So you can find me there. It's Palladium. And my name again is Siavash Tahan. And my Twitter handle is the same as my name.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for making the time. And we'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Vancouver Real Estate Today explores the art of living through genuine storytelling and localized expertise. If you enjoy what we do here, do us a favor and write us a review, and visit us at vancouverrealestatetoday.ca and discover the home that lets you express and live who you are.